Hi, in this lecture, we are going to finish our study of the GI tract organs by looking at the small and large intestine. So the small intestine, when you look at this and you see the word small, it's called small intestine because of the diameter. It's only about 1 inch in diameter, but it's actually very, very long. In a cadaver, it's about 20 feet long, and in a living person, it's roughly 10 feet long. So you might wonder why the discrepancy. The reason is that when you are alive, you have smooth muscle tone. And so the small intestine is contracted, which makes it shorter. When you die and those muscles all relax, it actually lengthens to about 20 feet. There are 3 portions to the small intestine. We know it starts up at the pyloric sphincter. So remember, the pyloric sphincter is between the stomach, the pylorus of the stomach, and the first part of the small intestine called the duodenum. As we go through the small intestine, it actually ends over by what's called the ileum, and then we have what's called the cecum. So the end of the small intestine is kind of this like orange color. This is all ileum. And then the first part of the large intestine is called the cecum. And so right at that junction, there's something called the ileocecal valve, which is basically a sphincter. And when that's open, that allows the contents from the small intestine, from the ileum, to enter the cecum of the large intestine. So the 3 portions are the duodenum, which is the shortest portion, and I've also heard it pronounced duodenum, but that always makes me think of Batman and Robin for some reason. Notice the duodenum kind of curves around the pancreas. It's pretty short, and it's going to receive all the secretions. So that chyme coming from the stomach, that acidic chyme, enters the duodenum, and then also the secretions from both the pancreas and the gallbladder and the liver are all going to empty into the duodenum. So when it enters in here, there's a sphincter inside the duodenum called the hepatopancreatic sphincter. And if you look at that word, notice you see hepato for liver and pancreatic. And so that is controlling all the entrance of materials from both the liver, which would be above, superior, and the pancreas. So when that sphincter is open, things like bile and juices from your pancreas can enter the duodenum. And when it's closed, the materials cannot enter. Now, in the duodenum, there's some glands that make a bicarb-rich juice. This is very important because remember that the chyme is very, very acidic. And there's another hormone release. It's called enterocrinin, and that stimulates the production of mucus from the in the duodenum. And so when we're looking at this, just know that you have the glands that have the bicarb, we have the mucus production, and those are protective mechanisms. That thick layer of mucus helps protect against what would be called a duodenal ulcer from that acidic chyme. Then the chyme goes through the jejunum, and from the jejunum, it goes into the ileum. Now, a lot of digestive processes will happen in the jejunum and the ileum. And as I mentioned, the ileum is the distal portion or the end of the small intestine. And when it comes over near the cecum, near the large intestine, you might remember you had these Peyer's patches labeled lymph nodules. But these Peyer's patches were special lymph tissue, and it helped protect the ileum from all the material that's inside the cecum, inside that large intestine, which is lots and lots of bacteria. Now, if you look at the microscopic anatomy of the small intestine, its main purpose is chemical digestion and absorption, so lots of adaptations to help with these processes. So it has the 4 tunics that we've already looked at, but we're going to focus on the mucosa layer right now. Remember the plica circularis? These are the folds that force the chyme to spiral through. So that's really helpful because as it spirals, it will force it to come in contact with these cells to help with absorption. The epithelial layer here is going to be simple columnar epithelial cells. So you can see kind of in this picture a little bit, and you see the drawing here. So we're going to have our simple columnar cells. They're called enterocytes. There's a few goblet cells, not many. We'll talk more about those in the large intestine. But the way that they're organized is they form something called villi. So you can see the villi here, they're finger-like projections. And if we come down to this image, this is one villus. Notice the villus is formed by many of those simple columnar cells, and you can see the drawing here. Each of these is one of these cells. So they kind of form this long finger-like projection. And the purpose of the villi is to increase surface area so that more of that chyme will come in contact with these cells to help with absorption. Now, if we look between the villi, down here we'll see things called crypts, intestinal crypts. So these are basically located between the villi, and they have a lot of those enteroendocrine cells, the DNES, or enteroendocrine cells that are going to make a lot of enzymes, and also what we call intestinal juice. And we'll talk about those components soon. If we look inside the villus though, notice each villus has, you see the red and the blue, it has a blood supply, and it has this green thing, which is a lacteal. And you might remember that a lacteal is a lymphatic capillary. So when we absorb materials, nutrients, the nutrients have to pass through these cells to get inside, remember, to the blood or the lacteal, so they can actually enter the body. And if we look at these little simple columnar cells, if we look at just one of them here, notice each of these have microvilli. And so the microvilli are just extensions of cytoplasm, but somebody called that the brush border. So when we say brush border, they're just referring to the appearance of these microvilli on these enterocytes. And a lot of times we'll talk about brush border enzymes. They're coming from these cells down in the crypts, but they get released through this brush border. So I've alluded to the function. It's critical for digestion, chemical digestion and absorption. That's one reason why it's so long. So it's long, it has the plica circularis, it has the villi to increase surface area. And so most absorption is here, and same with chemical digestion. So the enzymes are going to come from the pancreas or from the actual brush border of that small intestine. And this is why it's so long. In fact, food usually spends, you can say roughly 5 hours. You might say anywhere from like 3 to 6 hours in the small intestine, because you want to make sure you have a lot of time to break down those bonds and absorb those end products. So when we look at, what might speed it up or slow it down, there's another hormone, VIP, vasoactive inhibitory. So this stimulates glandular secretion, and it's going to open up those capillaries for absorption. Remember, inside the lacteal, you had your capillaries. So they dilate, more blood flows to the area, and that's going to help it pick up more nutrients. And we're basically looking at smooth muscle. We do use peristalsis, that wave-like contraction, but the small intestine uses a lot of this back and forth segmentation. So it can kind of squeeze and move the chyme back and forth to really help mix that food with all those enzymes as well. The reflex you just saw on the slide, I just went ahead and took that off because we actually already covered that, and that'll come back up in the large intestine. And so remember, we're looking at hours of food being processed as it passes through the small intestine, roughly 3 to 6 hours. Let's move on to the large intestine. So when we look at the large intestine, you can see it's called large because it has a larger diameter. It's about 2 inches in diameter. It's not as long as the small intestine. And if we look at the components, the gross anatomy, it starts with the cecum. So you can see that ileocecal valve. Remember, that was what we just looked at, the junction between the ileum of the small intestine, and then here's the cecum. There's this little pouch that sticks off the cecum called the vermiform appendix, or you can just call it the appendix. So, there's a lot of talk about the appendix. Do you need it or not? Well, it actually seems to have a function. It's full of good bacteria. So it's a little biofilm. So a lot of organisms live in here. And so if you ever wipe out the good bacteria in your large intestine, you can repopulate it from the bacteria in your appendix. So it does seem to help with that purpose. So when you see appendicitis, the itis on the end, what can happen is sometimes this little piece, the sac, can become inflamed. And the concern, if it becomes inflamed and swollen, is that it could rupture. And if it ruptures, the bacteria inside and inside your colon, your large intestine, is fine, but you don't want that bacteria being spewed in your abdominal pelvic cavity. That could cause peritonitis that we talked about earlier. So an appendicitis can be a life-threatening condition because if it's close to rupturing, they got to take it out because you don't want it to rupture. For some reason, it happens more in younger individuals. They say the opening's a little bigger, so you're more likely to get it inflamed. But usually when you have pain for an appendicitis, a lot of times it actually starts over by your belly button and then it moves down to your lower right quadrant. You might have vomiting and nausea, and it is a condition you need to get in because if it ruptures, then a lot of times you're dealing with major infection, peritonitis. A lot of times they have to put a drain in because there's so much of that bacteria. You get this bacterial infection in your gut, which is not good. Now, if we look at the colon has a couple pieces. So this is the large intestine, has an ascending colon, which runs up. This would be going up the right side, and then it curves. Now, your liver is right here. So they call this bend the hepatic flexure. That's where it curves. Notice the transverse runs across, and then it curves again, and over here is where your spleen would be, so they call it the splenic flexure. And then we have the descending colon, and then the sigmoid, which is kind of S-shaped, and then we have the rectum, and then the anus. So these are the components or the parts of the large intestine. You know, a lot of times if you have gas pain, you can massage your colon this way, so you kind of push up the right side of your body, across below your liver, down the left, and it might help actually move the gas bubbles. The sigmoid colon is this kind of S shape. Notice that it's over on the left. So if you're giving your patient an enema or suppository, a lot of times you will have them lay on their left side. It just kind of helps it get down and up into that sigmoid colon. The pieces here, you see these little like chunks, right? These are called haustra or haustrum. They're little pouches or folds in the wall of the colon. And then the tinea coli, it looks white here. It's this big extra piece of smooth muscle that runs all the way through. And this is really important because you'll see that basically when you have a bowel movement, you have what's called a mass movement. So this really helps with extra peristalsis to help move the feces out. And then if we come down to the rectum, and we have the rectum, then we have the anus. And on a lot of the anatomical models, the rectum is kind of, sometimes it stays behind in the torso, so you'll see it. And we have the anus. So the anal canal or anus, and there's a couple muscles here. So they're called sphincters. There's an internal sphincter in here, and then there's going to be an external. It's just more superficial. Not sure what happened there. So the internal sphincter is involuntary, it's smooth muscle, and the external is skeletal muscle. So this is important because defecation is a stretch reflex, and as that fecal matter comes down the rectum, it's going to stretch. And when it stretches, that's going to send a nerve impulse up to your spinal cord, up to your brain, so you know you got to go. And then the internal sphincter, because you can't control it, that's going to relax, basically, and then the feces is going to move, and then what we control is going to be our external sphincter. So that's the skeletal muscle, that's the voluntary one, and obviously we learn how to control that. So we'll go through the defecation reflex shortly. I just also want to mention hemorrhoids. You can get, there are blood vessels here, so if you get blood vessels that are inflamed, they're basically inflamed veins. They become distended and kind of bulge. It could be painful. It can happen if your patient is constipated from straining a lot, or you might see it after labor and delivery. If we look at the microscopic anatomy, no villi, we don't have a lot of absorption here, but a lot more goblet cells. And you might remember goblet cells make mucus, so we're going to want to have a thick layer of mucus to help move the feces through. Now, your large intestine has a lot of bacteria. In fact, fecal matter is mostly bacteria, what you're eliminating. And when we look at this, we call them the friendlies. So we have the bacterial flora. And that flora, that's your normal flora. You know, we have bacteria all over our body, but it's very, very important. So I'll be calling these the friendlies. And you can see some of them. You don't have to memorize the bacteria, but they have many important functions. So they really help protect us. Many ways they protect. One way is they just take up space. So if they take up space in the colon, then other pathogenic bacteria can't come in and replicate. They also compete with them. They, do their own little bacteria warfare. So your good ones are basically killing the pathogenic ones so that they can survive and stay there. We also know that these bacteria ferment for us. So we provide food and the source of fiber, and they metabolize that fiber, and they're going to make vitamins. Well, a side effect of all that fiber is that they make a lot of gas. They make flatus or flatulence. And so when you have flatulence, just know that your bacteria are fermenting and making vitamins. We also know that these flora are really important in a good immune system. So we know that there's some IgA produced here, and so they help provide a stronger immune system. There's even some evidence that they help with metabolism, help with maintaining a normal weight as well. So, if you lose the good bacteria, so, we have these normal bacteria, and these are some examples here, but maybe you go on broad spectrum antibiotics. So you're on antibiotic therapy, or you have a case of diarrhea that lasts a long time. What happens is you kind of wipe out the good guys, and then that leaves room for the bad guys, the pathogenic ones, to come in and take hold and really wreak havoc with your large intestine. So one thing we try to do are probiotics. And probiotics are things that we eat. We actually eat the live culture. So, a lot of times you'll see this in yogurt, sauerkraut. There's different foods that have this, the fermented teas. And so taking in probiotics is a good idea when you're on antibiotics because they help maintain the friendly so that the pathogenic can't gain a foothold. And you can see some of the things they actually help with. In fact, if you're not eating a diet rich in fruits and vegetables, unprocessed foods, you probably have changed the bacteria, the flora in your large intestine, and it might be good to add probiotics to your diet. And if you don't like yogurt or some of the other fermented foods, you can always take them. They sell them now, in pill form. Just make sure you get the ones that have a lot of cultures in them, and so they really help prevent the pathogenic. So, if we have a decrease in normal flora, we do worry about the pathogenic. And one of the worst ones is called Clostridium difficile, or we just say C. diff. And this is a nasty one. So if C. diff gets in, usually from broad spectrum antibiotics, so you have an infection and you're on it for a long time, you wipe out the good bacteria and then the C. diff takes hold, and you can see how deadly it's actually pretty bad. It can cause major diarrhea. It actually destroys the cells. It can be fatal in patients, and it can be very, very difficult to get rid of. So one of the treatments they do is a fecal transplant. So here's another list of some of the helpful ones in your probiotics. So you would definitely be taking those. Here's your harmful ones. But if someone has a C. diff infection and they're not able to clear it, they do fecal transplants. So they usually get someone close to the person, same household because you have same diets. They filter it. So if you think your job is bad, at least you're not literally filtering and blending shit, right? And then what they do is they take this slurry and they donate it. They can do a colonoscopy. I've seen where they can do an enema. I saw one that looked like pill form. I'm not really sure how that works. But the idea is now you're giving, a whole bunch of healthy bacteria in the feces, because remember, feces is mostly bacteria. So that, has been shown to actually help cure these C. diff infections. Now, as far as why we have a large intestine, again, it's reabsorbed water and bile salts. We haven't really talked about bile salts yet. It's coming shortly. Just know that when your materials enter your large intestine, they're watery. They're just like diarrhea. So if you've had diarrhea, that's a massive movement, right? You're not reabsorbing the water. That's why we worry about dehydration. So your waste products spend 12 hours roughly going through the large intestine. And as they go through, all that water is reabsorbed. So it's like, liters of water. The bile salts are what we need for digestion. They're in bile, but the bile salts are reclaimed. We do not eliminate them. We recycle them. So our large intestine absorbs those. Obviously to excrete the feces, right? Get rid of the waste products. And then it absorbs the vitamins that are made by the good guys. So I mentioned that the good guys, right? The friendlies make vitamins. These are some of the vitamins they make. So vitamin K, biotin is a B vitamin, and pantothenic acid. So you shouldn't really need to supplement with these if you have a good flora in your large intestine, because those bacteria make that as long as you feed them fiber. They're going to produce these important vitamins. So as I mentioned, the waste products can spend roughly 12-ish hours in your large intestine. We talked about these reflexes already. Remember when we eat, we are trying to move food out of the small intestine and into the large intestine. So a lot of times that could trigger defecation. The movement's fairly slow because we need to absorb all that water. It uses peristalsis. And then the mass movements are the really strong peristaltic wave. And these are what happen when you defecate. So I mentioned these tenea coli, right? This extra muscle that goes through. So that pushes for the mass movement, which we know is when you have a bowel movement to help eliminate that feces. And we know to have normal elimination of feces, we want to have that mucus from the goblet cells. And you also need to make sure you're hydrated. We want lots of water, because if you get dehydrated and have less water and fiber in your diet, it makes it harder to eliminate the feces. And so we know that the fiber and the soluble fibers help add bulk to your feces so that you can have regular bowel movements, which you should have them every day. The diverticula, if we look at, we talk about these pouches are called haustra. So a diverticula is like a little pocket. You see it kind of sticking out here. And so you might have some of them. They tend to be genetic. The issue is if they get inflamed, you get what's called diverticulitis. Same concern. We got lots of bacteria in here, so they get inflamed. You worry if they should rupture, it could be life-threatening and cause peritonitis. And so we know that there's certain things you can eat to decrease your risk of having your diverticulitis attack. I know it's very painful, and often individuals are hospitalized, probably given, antibiotics and fluids. And I also have heard that you should eliminate things like nuts or seeds, especially seeds that could, like sesame seeds, they could get caught in here and trigger that diverticulitis attack. And then I said we were going to end with pooping, with defecation. So we ended the last one with vomiting. This one will be pooping. So the reflex, we're not going through every step, but just know it's a stretch reflex. So as the fecal matter enters the rectum and stretches the rectum, it sends information to your spinal cord and brain. So you know you got to go. Then the brain, cerebral cortex, sends information back out the cord, down nerves, sacral nerves, to get down and relax the sphincter. So the internal sphincter is involuntary, so that will just open. And if you've ever had your internal sphincter open, you're aware because you're like, I gotta go, I gotta go, I gotta go. And then you're just clenching that external one. So that external sphincter is what we control until we're in an area where it's appropriate to defecate. And like I said, we have diapers for a reason. So this is a learned reflex, right? Babies don't know how to control this. And unfortunately, as we get older, if you have patients with either spinal cord issues or maybe dementia, Alzheimer's, then there will be problems controlling defecation as well. So this concludes our lecture on the intestines, and this is just a silly scrubs video on defecating that I'm just going to go ahead and post in our helpful links folder.